Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to be doing a deep dive into a topic that's clearly important to you, and that's the global impact of air pollution. You've sent over some really interesting articles, research notes, and I'm excited to get into it.
Yeah, I think this will be a good one.
Yeah, and one thing that really jumped out at me right away was this stat from the World Health Organization that 99% of the world's population breathes air that exceeds safe pollution limits, which is,
That's almost everybody.
I know, that's pretty crazy.
Yeah, it really underscores how widespread this issue is. It's not something that's limited to, just a few regions or countries.
Right. And looking at the research you sent over, it seems like the causes are a lot more diverse than just like factories and cars, which is what most people probably think of.
Yeah, definitely. Your sources highlight things like agricultural practices,
Right.
particularly the burning of crop residues and the use of certain fertilizers.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, those activities release a lot of pollutants into the air.
So it's not just about industrial emissions then. Right. It's a much broader picture. And then, of course, you also have natural events like wildfires.
Yeah, one of the articles actually mentioned that those are becoming more frequent and severe because of climate change.
Exactly. Climate change is kind of a threat multiplier in this sense.
Interesting.
It's creating conditions that lead to more intense and larger fires. And these fires release massive amounts of smoke and particulate matter into the atmosphere, which can impact air quality over huge distances.
Yeah, there was actually a really striking visual in one of the articles showing smoke plumes from wildfires in California traveling all the way across the country to the East Coast.
Wow.
Yeah, it really shows you how interconnected everything is.
It's a good reminder that air pollution doesn't respect borders or state lines.
Right. What happens in one place can affect people thousands of miles away.
Exactly.
Now, speaking of consequences, one thing that really stood out to me was the impact of PM 2.5. This was something you highlighted in your notes.
Yes, PM 2.5 refers to particulate matter that is less than 2.5 micrometers in diameter, which is incredibly tiny to give you a sense of scale. A human hair is about 30 times wider than one of these particles.
Wow.
And what makes them so dangerous is their size. Because they're so small, they can easily bypass our body's natural defenses.
Oh, so they can get in deep into your lungs.
Yeah, they can penetrate deep into our lungs and even enter our bloodstream.
That's kind of scary. I mean, I think most people associate air pollution with like respiratory issues, but one of the articles you sent mentioned a link between PM 2.5 exposure and heart disease.
Right. It might seem surprising at first, but the research is pretty clear. When these tiny particles enter the bloodstream, they can trigger inflammation and oxidative stress, which are known contributors to cardiovascular problems.
Huh.
And studies have shown a pretty strong correlation between long-term exposure to PM 2.5 and an increased risk of heart attacks, strokes, and other cardiovascular diseases.
So it's not just like it's serious long-term health problem.
Yes, exactly. And the health impacts go even beyond just heart and lung issues. Your sources also mentioned links to neurological problems, developmental delays in children, and even some types of cancer.
Wow.
So it's a really wide range of health concerns that we're only beginning to fully understand.
It's kind of a lot to take in. And then there's the environmental impact, too. I remember learning about acid rain in school, but one of your articles mentioned how it's still a major issue in certain parts of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Acid rain is caused by sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides released from burning fossil fuels.
Okay.
These pollutants react with water and oxygen in the atmosphere to form sulfuric and nitric acids, which then fall to the ground as acid rain.
Right.
And this acidic precipitation can have really devastating effects on forests, lakes, and rivers, damaging trees, acidifying water bodies, and harming aquatic life.
Yeah, one of your sources mentioned a study that found a 30% decline in tree growth in a specific region because of acid rain.
That's a significant impact, and it really highlights how air pollution can have this cascading effect on ecosystems.
Right, because if the forests are damaged, then they can't absorb as much carbon dioxide, which then makes climate change worse.
Exactly. And polluted waterways can harm fish populations, which impacts local economies and food security. It's all interconnected.
It's like a domino effect.
Yeah, a web of consequences.
Okay, so we've talked about the health impacts, the environmental impacts, but what about the economic costs? I know your research touched on that as well.
Yeah, the economic costs are substantial. They're multifaceted. Your sources highlighted things like healthcare expenses for treating pollution-related illnesses, lost productivity due to sick days and premature deaths, and even damage to infrastructure from acid rain and soot.
So it really hits us from all sides.
It does. It's a drain on resources on multiple fronts.
Okay, so we've established that air pollution is a major issue with some pretty serious consequences, but I'm curious about the solutions because your research also pointed to some potential solutions, right?
It does. While the situation might seem bleak, there are reasons for hope. Your sources point to a variety of technological innovations, policy changes, and even individual actions that can help mitigate air pollution and its impacts. And that's something we can explore further in the next part of our deep dive.
Sounds good. Let's take a quick break and we'll be right back to talk about those solutions. All right, so we've covered some of the causes and the pretty serious consequences of air pollution. But I want to talk about solutions now because your research also pointed to some potential solutions, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
definitely. I think it's important to highlight that while the situation can seem overwhelming, there are definitely reasons to be hopeful.
Okay, that's good to hear.
Your sources mentioned a variety of things like technological innovations, policy changes, and even individual actions that can help us address air pollution and its effects.
So it sounds like there's a lot we can actually do about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's helpful to break down those solutions into different categories. So maybe we could start with the technological advancements. What are some of the promising developments that you came across in your research?
Yeah, there are a few that really stood out to me. One was the development of more efficient and affordable renewable energy sources like solar and wind power.
Right. Those have become much more competitive with fossil fuels in recent years.
Yeah, and one of the articles actually mentioned a study that found that solar energy could potentially meet a significant portion of global energy demand by 2050.
That's pretty remarkable. And beyond solar and wind, there's also been a lot of progress in geothermal energy, tidal power, and even fusion energy, which is still in its early stages, but has enormous potential.
So there's a lot of innovation happening in the renewable energy sector.
Definitely a lot to be excited about there. But of course, energy production is only one piece of the puzzle. What about transportation? That's another major source of pollution, especially in cities.
Right. And, a lot of the sources I read highlighted the role of electric vehicles in reducing those tailpipe emissions.
Yeah, as battery technology keeps improving and costs continue to come down, electric vehicles are becoming a more and more attractive option for people.
Yeah, I've definitely noticed a lot more electric cars on the road lately.
Me too. But even with the shift to electric vehicles, it's really important to improve and expand public transportation systems as well.
Especially in cities.
Exactly. Efficient and reliable buses, trains, and subways can really help reduce the number of cars on the road, which would lead to lower emissions and less traffic congestion.
And that would make cities more livable in general, right? Less traffic, cleaner air, and maybe even more walkable neighborhoods.
Right. It's all about creating a more sustainable and enjoyable urban environment.
So it sounds like a combination of technological advancements and kind of like urban planning is really important here.
Absolutely. But it's not just about technology. Policy changes also play a crucial role.
Yeah, one of the things you highlighted in your notes was the need for stricter air quality standards and emissions regulations.
Yeah, governments really have a responsibility to set and enforce limits on the amount of pollutants that are released into the air.
Right, and that could mean like setting stricter standards for vehicle emissions, industrial emissions, and even agricultural practices.
Exactly. It's about creating a regulatory framework that incentivizes cleaner practices.
One of the articles I read talked about the success of cap-and-trade programs in reducing sulfur dioxide emissions from power plants.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, is that something that could be applied to other types of pollutants as well?
It's definitely a model worth considering. Cap-and-trade programs basically set a limit on total emissions and then allow companies to buy and sell permits to emit pollutants within that limit.
So it kind of creates a market for pollution reduction.
Right. It creates an economic incentive for companies to reduce their emissions and invest in cleaner technologies.
So it's a way to use market forces to drive environmental progress.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember that it's not just about big corporations and governments. Individual actions matter too.
Right. It's not just about like these big systemic changes. We can all do our part.
Absolutely. We can all make choices in our daily lives that contribute to cleaner air.
Like what kind of things?
Well, simple things like choosing to walk, bike, or take public transportation instead of driving alone.
Okay.
Reducing our energy consumption at home, being mindful of the products we buy and the companies we support. Making conscious consumer choices can make a difference.
One of the articles I read had a whole list of practical tips for reducing our carbon footprint.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Things like switching to LED light bulbs, using energy-efficient appliances, eating less meat.
Yeah, those are all great examples.
It's encouraging to know that we can all do something, even if it seems small.
It all adds up. And beyond individual actions, there's also the power of collective action. Joining or supporting organizations that advocate for clean air policies, educating ourselves and others about the issue, holding our elected officials accountable. Those are all ways to amplify our impact.
Yeah, I love that idea of collective action. It's a reminder that we're not in this alone.
Exactly. There's strength in numbers, and together we can make a real difference.
So it sounds like there are a lot of promising solutions out there, a mix of technology policy and individual action.
Absolutely. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. It's going to require a multifaceted approach.
But I'm also wondering about the feasibility of some of these solutions. Are there any challenges or obstacles that might stand in the way of implementing them effectively?
That's a really important question, and it's something that we'll definitely need to explore further.
Okay, so let's dig into those challenges and obstacles in the next part of our deep dive. So we've talked about some really promising solutions, a lot of cool tech policy changes, things we can do in our own lives, but are there any challenges or roadblocks that could make it harder to actually implement these solutions?
Yeah, you bring up a really important point. I mean, there are definitely challenges, and as your research pointed out, one of the biggest hurdles is often a political. Sometimes economic interests, particularly those tied to fossil fuels, can clash with environmental goals.
Right, so it's not just about having the solutions, it's about having the right policies and the political will to actually put them into action.
Exactly. It requires strong leadership from governments and a commitment to making clean air a priority. And sometimes that can be tough when there are other pressing issues competing for attention and resources.
Yeah, one of the articles actually talked about the influence of lobbying efforts by industries that benefit from the status quo. So there can be a lot of pushback against change from groups that stand to lose from a transition to cleaner energy.
Yeah, that's true. And it's something we need to be aware of. We need to advocate for policies that put the health of people and the planet ahead of short-term profits for a select few.
So it's a reminder that these kinds of systemic changes don't happen overnight. They take time, effort, and a lot of engagement from citizens, policymakers, and businesses.
Absolutely. And another challenge that came up in your research was the issue of funding and resources, especially for developing countries.
Right, because transitioning to cleaner technologies and infrastructure takes a lot of investment.
It does. And that could be a major barrier for countries that don't have the financial capacity to make those investments.
Yeah, one of your sources actually mentioned a study that found a significant funding gap for clean energy projects in developing countries. So it seems like there's a real need for more international cooperation and support to help bridge that gap.
I agree. Addressing air pollution effectively requires a global approach. Developed countries have a responsibility to help developing countries transition to cleaner energy and more sustainable practices.
Right. It's about working together, sharing knowledge and resources to create a more equitable and sustainable future for everyone.
Exactly. And, even when we do manage to implement solutions, it's not always easy to guarantee their effectiveness.
How so?
Well, take electric vehicles, for example. They're great for reducing tailpipe emissions, but if the electricity they're using is still coming from dirty sources like coal-fired power plants, then we're not really solving the problem.
So we have to look at the bigger picture, the entire life cycle of a solution, not just its immediate impact.
Exactly. We need to think holistically and consider all the interconnected pieces, and that includes issues of equity and access, too.
What do you mean by that?
Well, your research pointed out that air pollution often disproportionately affects marginalized communities, people who live closer to industrial areas or highways or who have less access to green spaces or healthcare.
Right. One of your sources mentioned a study that found a correlation between air pollution levels and socioeconomic status in some cities.
Exactly. So environmental justice has to be a key part of this conversation.
Yeah.
We need to make sure that solutions are implemented in a way that benefits everyone, especially those who are most vulnerable to the effects of air pollution.
So it's about ensuring that everyone has the right to breathe clean air no matter where they live or how much money they make.
Exactly. And at the end of the day, individual behavior still matters, even with the best policies and technologies. If we're not making conscious choices in our daily lives, we're not going to see the kind of change we need.
So it goes back to that idea of collective action. We all have a role to play in creating a healthier future for ourselves and for generations to come.
I completely agree. It's about recognizing that our individual choices combined with collective action and systemic change can create a powerful force for positive change.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into this really complex issue, what's the key takeaway you would leave our listeners with?
I think the main takeaway is this air pollution is a serious global challenge, but it's not insurmountable. There are solutions, and there's reason to be hopeful, but it requires a collective effort from everyone. Individuals, governments, businesses all working together to prioritize clean air and to put those solutions into action.
I think that's a great message to end on. It's been a really informative and inspiring conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us.
It's been my pleasure. These kinds of conversations are so important for raising awareness and motivating people to get involved.
And to our listeners, we hope this deep dive has left you feeling informed and empowered. The fight for clean air is a fight worth fighting, and every single one of us can make a difference.
Even small changes can have a ripple effect.
So as we sign off, we'll leave you with this question. What one small change will you make today to contribute to cleaner air? It could be anything from choosing to walk instead of drive to supporting a local organization working on cleaner initiatives. Every action counts. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive into a topic that matters to you.